Hey, Tony. Thanks for coming, man. I appreciate it.
Happy to be here, man.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, man, I wanted to kind of start with a couple things, but before we get started, I think the idea that to give a little bit of exposure around exactly kind of what you do, and maybe give the audience a little bit about not only what you do, but why you do it.
Oh, sure. So my name's Tony Alampi. I'm the owner of X Factor Consultants. We are a technology and e-learning consulting and design and development company. We're a virtual business, but I live here in the Woodlands area, and we're all U.S. based. So most of my guys are in Texas, Houston, and Austin, but we have some people on the East and West Coast as well. Started the business coming on 9 years ago now. In a previous life, I worked in video game development. And I taught game development as well, so it sort of led nicely into working in a different but still tech-related field and being in consulting, which is sort of teaching for adults. And that naturally led to being in e-learning as well. So I've worked in a few different uh, parts of the tech sector, and I've worked with a lot of different kinds of people in very multidisciplinary fields. When you work in games, you work with everyone. You have programmers and you have back-end guys and front-end guys and artists and musicians and managers and anyone you can imagine. So I really love putting things together, and I love craftsmanship, and I love working with lots of different kinds of interesting people. So that's
Yeah,
sort of a quick overview of where I come from and where I'm at.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So, why is learning so hard?
Depends on who you ask, right? Well, for starters, different people learn in different ways, and it feels like every few years someone has some blinding insight as to know this is the way people learn. It's like it's never over. It's like studies where
Yeah,
today coffee gives you cancer and tomorrow it's the cure. It's like make up your mind. It's sort of unending, but it does at
sure.
least speak
It's
to
science, though, right?
yeah. It does at least speak to clearly there is variation in how
Mhm.
people learn and what it is effective. The fact that it's not clear specifically what the best way to do this is, I think in and of itself demonstrates that, right? So people learn in different ways, and also the pressures that we are under in a given day that occupy our minds are always changing and have been for a very long time. For the majority of human existence over thousands of years, life was pretty simple. And then we had this, what we call the Enlightenment, right? And in a very short period of time, human society and human life changed very dramatically. And it hasn't really gotten any simpler since. I have 9 kinds of insurance, right? Like just me. so
Yeah,
so the load of what complicates your life in a given day has just increased more and more and more. And as a consequence of that, the uh, strategies that we use to learn and the time we feel we have to do it, that is what has changed quite a bit, right? If you're a working adult and you have a house and you have a family and you have responsibilities, it's a lot harder to find time to make yourself sit down and learn a new thing where you don't even know the fundamentals, right? And you're
yeah,
starting basically from scratch. Uh, and so there's this pressure to find ways to teach lots of information much more efficiently, more so than has ever been the case. So I think part of what makes people struggle to learn is just their own preferences and their own capacity for learning. But another part of it is just the general moment in human history that we're at.
yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. And Sylvester Stallone just came out in a recent clip that I saw. And he talked about how life gets harder, not easier, as you get older. There's this idea that, well, oh, you get older and you can retire and life
Yeah.
is just easy, and he's like, no, it's not. It actually is harder. Things become more difficult, more complex, and learning does that too,
Oh, yeah.
right? Learning, you think about the exponential amount of knowledge and information we have today versus thousands of years ago. That's a lot more new information that we now have to soak in. History books are much bigger
Oh,
than
yeah.
they were a couple hundred years ago.
Funny how that goes, isn't it? Right. And by extension of that, sorting through that information to determine what is even useful to learn to
Right.
begin with. That's really the greatest challenge, right? When I was in games, my focus was usability design. And UX, UI, as I say, right? So user experience, user interface. And
Sure.
for the uninitiated, that's really the study of understanding what a user's interests are when they approach any kind of interactive program, a game, an app, a website, whatever. What are their interests? What are they looking for? What kind of information do they expect to see? What do they not know they need, but they're going to appreciate when they find it? And how can you maximize the appeal of that experience to make sure they get what they want as quickly as possible in a satisfying way, and ideally keep them coming back. So in order to do that job effectively, you have to understand people's deeper motivations and also what turns them off, right? And what they struggle with. And there are all kinds of theories and models and rules that are applied to that industry, but there are also just general heuristics and things that everyone just sort of knows. Okay, do this, don't do this. And one of those is limit how many buttons you have in a navigation. Sure, we've all been to like a website that has 1,000 buttons in the nav or whatever, and that's not
Yep.
a good idea because there's a certain number of interactions you can have all on display at once for people to make a choice and feel satisfied with that choice. And once you start adding more options, there's a point where even if they were to choose the same option on a menu with 10 buttons as if it had five, they will be more likely to doubt that choice, even if they made the same one, even if it leads to the same result, because they have those five other options in their head that they could have taken instead, and they don't know what the opportunity cost of that decision was, right? Because it's now potentially
Yeah.
double what it could have been. So just the fact that there is more to know makes it much harder to know what you should know and be satisfied with what you know. Especially now that we can see it through this magical screen uh, that connects us to the entire planet instead of just
Yeah.
being able to look out our window and down the street. So the sheer number of things that you could learn but aren't going to is just so much greater, and our exposure to it is so much greater. And the human mind, broadly speaking, has not still adapted particularly well to that new environment. It's happened terrifyingly fast, and some people have a pretty good handle on it. But unless you do this for a career like me, it's not necessarily something that comes naturally. And so there's a lot of people are just struggling with that right now. And I hope that in some way we can, through the work that I do, we can help people figure out a better way of evaluating what they do need to learn and don't learn, and being satisfied with the choices they've made.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I really like the background that you have because things are more gamified these days, right? There's a lot of these ideas that, well, if you can take learning, there's actually a whole history and team development and philosophy and like market around adult learning,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
That used to be that, oh well, they just learn the same as everybody else. Like, no, adults learn very different than children do.
Yep.
But the idea is that, well, we're supposed to have this children-like curiosity. Well, that doesn't come naturally when you're not a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's something that has to be, again, relearned.
Right.
And so when you start looking at, like, we're witnessing AI, automation, robotics becoming huge core elements of businesses. Some businesses, you could also argue that the idea that, well, some businesses are just deploying it and they have no idea what they're actually deploying. They're just like
Yeah.
getting on
There's
the
plenty of
bandwagon.
that.
But what are some of the most exciting ways that you've seen technologies transform how companies operate and tackle these challenges? And we don't even have to go AI at this
Mhm.
point. I think if you want to speak to
Broadly.
that, that's great. But I
Yep.
think technology in general, historically, how has that kind of adapted and met some of the challenges that you see in e-learning and learning in general?
Oh yeah. Well, AI is definitely a big part, and I will talk about that because it's kind of impossible to talk about this without
Hundred
doing it. I
percent,
mean,
hundred
it's
percent.
affected our own process quite a bit in a very positive way as of now. We'll see how that changes over time. But
Sure.
uh, but the so we'll say there's been a few different seasons to the business over the years. We've always been a tech and web oriented business. But the primary lines of business that I've pursued have changed over time as I've scaled, right? Like I started as just a guy. I was an individual. I worked in games, and then I left games, and I said, okay, I didn't want to be in games. And that was actually here's a good example. In games, when I left, it was because of VR specifically.
Okay.
Virtual reality had. I lived in the Austin area at the time, and that was the epicenter of virtual reality game studios, and it took the games industry by storm. This was 2016. And there was a very specific moment in the games industry where everyone was obsessed to an almost, it always felt, the word cult is sort of charged, but it felt like a lot of people were drinking the Kool-Aid because they were not considering the practical long-term ramifications of trying to make everything VR. They didn't consider how, well, most people don't want a box slapped on their face for 6 hours straight.
Yeah.
Most people
Yeah.
are already frustrated enough by the fact that they have to look through this box that is not attached to their face for any
Sure.
period of time, never mind literally having it strapped onto you, where it deprives you of the rest of your senses. So I thought there's no way that this is going to be the de facto standard in interactive entertainment. It's not going to happen. Um, I thought, okay, there'd be some niche interest groups that would really love it, but that is often not enough to carry many industries, never mind the games industry, where just the expense to build a modern game can be in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Like
Yeah.
the revenue you need to support that is extraordinary. So I knew, okay, it's not going to happen. Um, but I saw that every studio was redirecting significant effort, even the big guys, even AAA studios, they were jumping on the bandwagon wholesale. And I thought, this is not going to end well. Uh, and all of these other young game devs that I know, they are redirecting all of their effort to becoming VR game developers. And that's great until one day the floor falls out from under them and they're not going to have a job and they're going to have to
What gave
redirect.
you but what gave you that kind of that foresight? Like, how did you kind of understand that better than these other companies did at the time?
So part of it was, so my parents were both entrepreneurs growing up. My mom owned a communications consulting firm, so she taught corporate executives, managers, people at state agencies, how to communicate more effectively, at a top level with their subordinates, negotiate better contracts, lead their teams more effectively. So she worked with very high level people to make them be even better at what they did. And my dad, in true Italian immigrant stereotypical fashion, owned a pizzeria for 13 years because, of course, he did. Uh, so I had these two very
Nice.
different kinds of industries that I saw. And he eventually went on to be a business broker where he would help people sell their restaurants. So
Okay.
we had, more like, brick and mortar, blue collar, like sweat of your brow kind of business. And then also we had a more, esoteric and theoretical kind of business consulting like what we do, right? And I saw how the 2008 housing crisis destroyed both of their businesses in different ways. And because it really just killed the economy in general,
Yeah.
right? And
Sure.
I'd seen the build up to that of them growing their business, and I saw how it really affected them. And so I had the privilege, I would argue, of from a very early age being initiated to the consequences of failure in business. Because I remember wondering, like, are we gonna be able to afford a mortgage? Parents. I was
Hmm.
at like middle school when it happened. They tried pretty hard to hide it, but you can only hide
Yeah.
that level of stress so much, right? And they ended up
Absolutely.
being okay. But I saw that very early on. I understood it, and I thought, okay, this is the real consequence of what happens when they weren't even they didn't make really like, stupid decisions or anything. It wasn't that. It's just they
Sure.
were newer businesses. My mom's was at least, and their largest client was in the housing industry, and they finally swung that deal. And then the timing of it was right when the housing market collapsed. And one of the first lines of business that tends to get cut in any kind of massive shift is training of any kind because it's thought of as non-revenue generating, right? It's thought
Yep.
of as a liability and expense.
Yep. Sure. Sure.
So they had it, and then about a year in, it got ripped out from under them.
Mm.
And that, just getting through that to try and get additional clientele, it's really hard, right? So I saw that happen. And I thought, wow, even if you do everything right, it doesn't necessarily matter. Sometimes a bad roll of the dice can do you in. So I learned to just be very cautiously optimistic, but still careful. Bullets before cannonballs, right? And
Yeah.
as an entrepreneur, especially, one of the defining characteristics is you get excited about something that is inherently risky, and then you want to just go for it, because that's what makes you do this. No,
Right.
no
Yeah.
person
Oh
who
yeah.
didn't have that
100%.
natural inclination would start a business if they
It's true.
weren't. That
So
wasn't who
true.
they were, right? So inherently, there's a level of I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do that. No, stop. Restrain yourself. Really look at the big picture. So I learned through exposure to that to just take a step back and wait a little while and say, okay, does this pass the market test, right? And for me, if you want to distill, at least in tech, the market test for me is, does this solve a legitimate problem better, significantly better than pre-existing solutions?
Yep.
And does the potential customer are they capable of even having an adequate perception of just how much better your solution
Mm.
is? Because you can make something that's light years ahead of everyone else, but if no one gets it, it doesn't matter. They're not going to buy, right?
Yeah. So
So
true.
yeah, those are I look for those. If you want to, there's more to that, but if you want to simplify it to two things, it's got to pass both of those things. VR did not sufficiently solve a problem significantly greater than anything else. It was just a different flavor of doing the same thing we'd always done with some added
Yep.
perks. And it, although it had visual appeal, like you could market it in an interesting way, you could show what it was, it wasn't enough to convince people to override their basic deep-seated survival instincts, which is, would you sit with a box slapped to your face and deprive your senses riding on the bus? No?
Yeah.
Well, then why buy a Google Cardboard? Right? Why do you need
Yeah.
that for your phone? So it wasn't so powerful that it would convince people to go against what they naturally were, and it did not solve a problem significantly greater than anything else. So as far as I'm concerned, it didn't pass either component of the market test, and it naturally found its place where I always thought it would, which would be in industry, industrial,
Hmm.
in military, in medical, because all of those scenarios are.
Safety.
hmm Yep, where the cost of getting something wrong is so substantial that any solution that can help
Hmm.
you avoid getting something wrong is worth it. And it's a controlled environment where people come and go. You go to your job, you put the goggles on, you do VR, and then you leave and go home and don't have to look at it. So it solves that problem of people maybe not wanting to be inclined to spend a ton of time in it because it's just compartmentalizing the job. And then, okay, if you're designing, a jet engine, it's a lot cheaper to visualize that in 3D space with VR than it is to actually build a prototype and then hope it works, right? So it solved the market test, it solved perception issues, it fit that use case. It was never meant to be mass consumer products, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe things will change, but at that point, that's where I was at, and now we're almost 9 years later, and Meta is struggling explicitly because
Hmm.
of what I've described, right? Um,
Yeah.
so it doesn't really. It didn't take a genius to figure a lot of this stuff out. I'm not going to say that I'm. I just had some blinding insight that no one could possibly have thought of. It's more just um, I I worked. I was taught not to fall for fear of missing out pretty early on, and just take a step back and wait. If something
Yeah.
survives the market test for a few years, maybe I'll buy it. But up until that point, not going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's probably the earliest example I have of how technology really changed an industry, because exactly what I thought come to pass would. A lot of those people who got into VR, not only are they not working in VR, they're not working in games anymore,
Yeah.
because they put all
Well,
their chips on red, and then here we
yeah.
are.
Well,
Yeah,
I always say people that if you want to win in the casinos, you have to have the most money.
yep, yep,
And this is the same thing. This right is true of this space as well. And the reason why I think the Meta is going to end up winning in this space, or at least in the short term,
yep,
is because they're able to play the long term. Right? They're
yeah,
able to say we can put as much money as we need to in this.
right,
You've got Mark Zuckerberg, that's now I think the second largest or second richest person in the world,
yep,
right? Just with everything that's going on. So they have the money to do it. And so they can stay in the game longer and
right,
just wait till everybody else kind of just falls off
yeah,
and then just take it, right?
yeah,
So I think there's a big key to that. I also would say I think we need the holodeck. I mean, that's what we really need, right?
yes,
We're trying to promote this as a holodeck, and it's not. The
right,
expectations is that people are still. I had the same issue when we were deploying, the Hololens for oil companies, and it was like everybody that put it on was expecting to be Iron Man.
yeah,
And I'm like, no, you're not Iron Man.
yeah.
This is so far from Iron Man. And I think what
This is the
happens
one
with
he built in the cave that fell
yeah,
apart after 5 minutes. Yeah,
yeah.
right.
And it's like, no, but VR is the same thing. I think everybody's trying to say this is the holodeck, and it's like,
Right.
no, everybody's seen Star Trek. This is not the holodeck.
Right.
That
It's
would
a
be really
means
cool.
to an end. It's not the end. It was being treated as the end. It's not.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
Yeah, once you have the holodeck, it's not possessing your senses in the same way. That limitation is not there, and you can leave
Yep.
the room and it's gone, and you don't have to deal with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not. You're not so tied to you putting a thing on you and being absorbed by that thing, and it's not just naturally blending into the environment around you and becoming part of the world. That's what it has to be. It has to be effortless and subtle,
Agreed.
and only obvious when you want it to be. And right now, VR is none of those things.
Mm.
So you're right. Like, it can get there. And Meta, I don't think Meta is doomed to fail. I understand why they went down this route, because they're right that like Facebook was on the way out. It hasn't been what it used to be in a long time, and they knew they had to evolve, and they knew they were better positioned than anyone else to do that, and
Mm-hmm.
to create that convergence of technologies that they're going for. Whether or not that's a good idea in and of itself, and the ethical ramifications and all of that, that's a whole other conversation. But let's just say
Hopefully.
that's something they're going to do, and
Sure.
people are going to buy it probably. yeah, they're better positioned than anyone else to put the R&D into it to go from their Quest to the eventual holodeck, where it's a fixture in an environment and not something you have to put on yourself, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right. Like they can outlast everyone else and just churn and eventually get there. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And, going back to some of the other things you said in regards to learning, when you think about the friction that has kind of been taken off
Mhm.
of, from using your phones to, as before that was just doing like PowerPoint, quizzes and stuff, right?
Right.
It was just brutal. You just
Oh yeah.
like not want to do, or videos of, somebody talking over and you couldn't go forward, right? You had
Yeah.
to wait until the whole video stopped.
And if you
And
close the
now,
tab out, there's no way of finding where you were, and you have to
no way,
restart it
yeah,
all. There's no, yeah, a
exactly,
lot of
right?
things have changed. Yeah,
So so you went from there to potentially there are companies, there's a lot of companies out there that are using VR, and I think rightly so. That's a great segue, because there are certain things, especially when you talk about safety. There's an element in VR that you can actually experience to a high level of degree where you can't in just videos or
right.
phones or screens, where you actually can see consequence. You
Yes.
can actually actually put those scenarios in play.
Make it personal, make them
M-
feel it. That's
Make
where
it
it's
personal.
valuable. Yes, because
a
it's
hundred
loss, it's risk
percent
mitigation.
a
Absolutely. Yeah.
hundred percent.
Mhm.
But when we start getting into the idea that people want to do this, because I
Yeah.
think that's the key. People, need to do safety exercises. They need to do
Right.
safety training. They need to do training for their normal jobs.
Right.
Right. There's actually we had a company called Squint AI.
Mhm.
They're really playing big into the space of um uh like manufacturing just in time training. They're able to do it in kind of like the Microsoft had their oh my gosh, what is it called? Uh I'm losing blank. Oh my gosh. Microsoft had their guides. Microsoft guides
Mhm.
was something similar to that, where you could, hey, I'm going to walk over here. I have a pointer. Oh, I have to go here and I have to walk through this space. And it's like, okay, that's great, but I'm still having this, like, to your point, we have this huge thing on our head
Right.
and we can't get out of it. Do we want to do it, or do we have to do it?
Right.
And I think we actually get to the point of we want to do this is fun.
Yeah.
This is like playing, GTA or something,
Yeah.
right? And then it's like, okay, now we've crossed that. But until we get to the AI part of it, where we actually can say, hey, you want something different than I do, how do we get to that? And so we start looking at, let's just go for the example here, China, Squirrel AI.
Mhm.
You probably know Squirrel AI being in e-learning. But Squirrel AI is something that they've been developing for years in China for their educational system.
Mhm.
And it's adaptive learning that they're putting out throughout all of their different school systems. And so when you say like China is leading the way, developing this AI learning, which they've been used, they've probably been, number two to US probably right now,
Yeah.
in all the spectrum of things. One of the companies you may have, like, I guess, let me back up. If Squirrel AI is something that is being developed within educational systems,
Mhm.
how do we get there for adult learning systems?
Mm. So there's, I guess, the beauty of the Western system of having lots of different experiments instead of just centralizing it in one place and rolling it out, right? Is that you get to test a lot of different things to see what works. And there are a lot of different private companies in the United States and in Europe that are trying a lot of different ways of accomplishing exactly that. Of like, how do we build learning systems that different people in different fields who learn in different ways can all find useful, right? And I do think AI is a part of that. Um, I think that okay, so there's a few kinds of media that you can serve to people, right, in the e-learning space. I mean, you have text, you have video, you have interactive environments, and I think we generally work in the vertical of like technical training, right? So a lot of the work that we do
Mm-hmm.
is teaching people how to code or how to set up, back end environments or manage Azure and things like that, right? So we're doing a lot of like very specific technical things. If we want to go broader into safety training and things like that's a whole another topic. I'll just focus on like specifically what we do, right?
Sure.
So we're focusing on specifically technical skills that are already done in a computer. So you're teaching them in the context of what they're doing, where they're going to work, right? You're learning how to do a thing in the computer and you're learning it in the computer. So inherently that reduces quite a bit of the friction, which is cool, right? The biggest innovation that a lot of different kinds of e-learning platforms in the West have been trying to roll out have been interactive coding environments where and we've done a number of these over the years, code labs, right, where you have a browser-based environment of some kind where you're told, okay, you're going to build this mini app and it's going to do these things. We did one recently where it was a time tracking app where it was based in Laravel, which is a PHP framework,
Okay.
and it needed to teach you how like services and middleware work. So like the idea is, okay, you're building a time tracking app, and it's going to send an email to the admin whenever your a worker's hours go over 40 hours a week, because that's an HR concern, right? So it was just like a real world use case to demonstrate uh, how do you build this thing in the environment that it would actually work in. And how do you verify it is working? How do you validate it? All of that, right? So there's a lot of building that has to be done to make an environment like that function. But it's by far the best way of testing to make sure people actually know what they're doing is make them do the thing, right? So I think at least from a technical perspective, a lot of the power in using, let's say, AI would be to validate if in fact people have done what they think they're supposed to be doing, right? Like
Sure.
there are different ways to teach the same idea, but at the end of the day, you really need to confirm they've actually learned it. So serving that information in variety of ways is cool, but making sure that they actually what they've produced is what it needs to be or close to what it needs to be, that's where AI can really come in handy, right? Because there are, I mean, in software development of any kind, there are many ways to accomplish the same goal, right? And old school forms of validating code are very linear. It's okay, this is exactly the way you're supposed to write the script down to the
Mm-hmm.
indent. And if you didn't write it like that, it flags you. And that's not how being a software developer actually works, right? But having one of the great things about a lot of AI systems we have is that they can code very well because they're a machine and they understand what machines want, right? So for prototyping code, they're great. But it also means they can validate code, make sure it actually makes sense, which means that if the user puts a certain level of variation in, it could account for that and make sure it's still logical in a way that older testing methods weren't as great at. So I actually think that's probably one of the primary benefits of having these systems, if they're integrated properly, and at least in technical training, is validating that what you're doing is correct, using them to assess the student, not just serve them information, but validate what's been done. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something where, I mean, it takes time to make that happen. A lot of companies they're really just they're starting and building it and maintaining it, and they're discovering the pitfalls of maintaining systems like that, because when you want to have a browser-based interactive environment that assesses 1,000 different stacks of technology, it's quite the experience to maintain it
Yeah.
all, because every new stack has new versions and all that. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. But that's what I'm hoping we get to, is that we have a pretty great way of in browser validating and what a student is doing. So that's really what I would say. Like that, that's what I'm looking for. And that's what I'm seeing happen right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we're working in. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I love the validation point of it because I think you're so right. You have to learning something or knowing something is different than doing something and
Yep.
doing something well.
Hmm.
Uh, but part of me almost also wonders, are we being conditioned to be trained by machines?
And what are the consequences of that?
I
Yes.
mean, yeah. So,
Uh-huh.
I mean, everything's so customized. We talk
Right.
about, AI, and we even talked about like the Scroll AI with, early education.
Yeah.
We're getting to a point now where we're actually getting trained
Yeah.
by robots, by machines, by systems, and
Yeah.
very, like you mentioned, like if one thing is wrong, like, oh, well, you can't do that. But and in coding, it is very black and white for the
Yeah.
most part, right? There are certain, now, of course, other languages you can argue that maybe that's not so much black and white, but for the majority, if you do this, it's all inputs and outputs.
Yeah, there
But
are
it's
most efficient ways of making something happen that you can
right.
mathematically get to. Right. Yeah.
But
Sure.
the creative is the part that you kind of end up stopping, or maybe
Right.
not being able to produce in much or encourage.
Yeah.
More connections. We've got less communication
Yeah.
with Facebook. You got more information and knowledge. We get less wisdom.
Yeah.
We have slower resolution, faster quick fixes. And I think it's interesting because at the end of the day, when we look at coding in general and coding applications and coding everything, some of the things, like for instance, I still watch YouTube and any other streaming service, and I get ads that I don't want to see.
Oh yeah.
And I'm like, we live in 2024. How am I still not getting something that actually makes more sense for me?
Right.
Is
I
it
have
just
ad block,
because?
so that's why.
It's crazy that we ask for customization, we ask for these things, but yet when we're looking at how are we being trained,
Right.
are we being trained to think about things outside the box and to question, or are we just saying do this, do it well, don't ask questions?
Yeah, and that is, there's a broader philosophical question there, right? Which is, I'm glad that it is a part of the AI discussion because let's be real, a lot of engineers are not naturally inclined to ask the philosophical side of it. And I speak that from personal experience of working on AI projects where that's sort of my job, is to make sure, okay, well, are we considering that? Because,
Yeah.
you have team engineers, they do the job, and like that's the thing. It's okay, what's the spec? What are the
Mm-hmm.
requirements? Go.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think there are personality traits that naturally cluster together very well. And
Yep.
I think a lot of the very creative people are more inclined to ask about the philosophical and maybe the ethical concerns of this than the people who are going to build things, because it's inherently, it's a floaty, esoteric kind of thing where there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers, and they're a lot more comfortable with that. Whereas people that really like to build things and put them together and make them work in an exact specific way inherently are not as interested in things that can't be distilled into measurements of any kind. And I find myself at a strange intersection, as I always have, in that I feel very comfortable with a lot of unknowns, but I also like to put things together and make them work a specific way, and I can do both.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, I feel I get along pretty well with people from both camps, but I see their differences, and I'm often the connective tissue between them. So I ask myself these questions a lot, and actually I had a moment with myself last week where I was thinking of experimenting with a machine learning model that you train it off of your voice to do voiceover for you, so that I could, as an optimization tool, because I do a lot of
Sure.
voiceover work. And I was
Okay.
about to click accept to let it use my voice, and then I thought, I don't know, and I didn't.
Okay.
So I had
Why?
that
But
right.
why? But why?
Yeah. Well, because I don't know 10 years from now what that company and what that license agreement are going to evolve into, and I don't know if I'm going to have to. I don't know if I'm going to like what they'll do with whatever I have put into it, because I know in this moment exactly how they say they're positioning themselves, but I don't know if that's going to change. You know.
Yeah, but
Eh,
could you, to that point though, if they are going to act unethically, would you say that was the sense of them not actually getting your permission in the first place?
Sure, and that's why you don't give them things, right? Yeah. And
But yeah, but like
yeah, yeah.
even doing a podcast and being in the internet forever,
Oh, sure, yeah.
you can, I mean, our voice, our our likes, I talked about it in a previous conference that I did, was that after 300 likes, Facebook knows you better than your spouse.
Oh, yeah.
That's
And
crazy, right? And so like we're actually volunteering stuff about ourselves all day long without even us giving permission to.
oh yeah, and there is merit in that, but privacy and security have, as concepts, changed. Like, it still exists. I think it just means something different than what, let's say, our parents' generation thought of it as. Privacy and security used to mean people don't know things about you
Mm-hmm.
at all, and I think now it means people can find anything out about you, but they don't care, or they're not going to bother, or they don't know to sort through it effectively unless you give them a reason to, and you make yourself a target, right? And if you have content out there, well, people still have to crawl it, and they have to process it, and they have to pull it in. And maybe they're pulling everything in, but it's a lot of data. And right now, quantum computing isn't really in a place where that's energy efficient or pragmatic. So generally speaking, your data really only gets processed if you go out of your way to give people a reason to, right? Whereas if you just voluntarily give someone your data and accept the terms of it, but you put it specifically in a context where it's easily accessible, well, then they just have to look it up within their own system, right? So it's a little bit, it's a little bit easier, I'll say, if you're at least accepting license terms and giving them an exact model of your voice, as opposed to
Yeah.
making them say, "Go and find me." And they could, like, if
You're
they know what they're
keeping
doing,
honest
it's
people honest.
yeah, yeah. If they, I mean, maybe it takes them 30
Yeah.
minutes, but it turns out that 30 minutes, there's a whole lot of other things people would like to do with their 30 minutes and go after you specifically, right?
Yeah.
So this is yeah, this is something that's confounded people, forever. Is like, how do you? I mean, even I don't know. The you can be under investigation by the FBI and they still miss stuff, and they're looking for you
Sure.
because human fallibility is still a factor. So, so um, no, so I had that moment just because, if nothing else, I didn't want to sign up for it, right? I
Yeah.
figured I'd make it incrementally more difficult. Now, it might not make a difference in the end, who knows? But I thought, if nothing else, this is a good moment to make sure at least I have a set of rules for myself about how I am engaging with these things, as opposed to just only focusing on the shiny thing right in front of me, which is, oh, this will save me maybe an hour of work every week.
Hmm.
But at what cost, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's worth doing the extra hour of work just for the sake of doing it, especially if you can't conceive of the potential consequences of it. So
Yeah.
I stand by that decision as of
Okay.
now. Yeah,
No, that's
I'm glad you asked it. It's a good point. Yeah.
yeah, it's just interesting, and I think that it actually is a nice segue into one of the questions I had around privacy, and that was that whose job is it to be responsible for individuals' privacy? Is it
Mm,
the individual itself, or is it the companies that are making the software? Who
right.
holds that responsibility in your mind?
So taking like legal framework aside and just thinking about
Sure,
like who should feel responsible and act
sure,
responsibly,
absolutely.
I think both. If we're not thinking about legal, because when we go into legal, it's like, okay, there's
Yep,
it's a fight and who wins. That's what we care about. If we're just
sure.
talking about philosophically, then I think both. And if one party fails, and they don't just get to say, well, the other guys didn't do this. Like, no, it's on both of you, because on the one hand, yes, companies, they're storing a ton of data, and they should carry with themselves a sense of responsibility over that data. If they're going to own the servers and they're going to hold that information, they're going to use that information. They just say, we got to take this really seriously, right? And you certainly hope they do. They don't always, but you hope they do. But on the flip side, as a consumer is not a hapless victim who just bumbles through life, without any responsibility in the world. At least they shouldn't be. Some people live
Hmm.
like that, but I don't think that's wise and or effective. I think your life is better if you, even if there is a legal framework to support you, even if you would be found as a victim in a situation where there was a data breach or something, I think you still have at least a base level responsibility to actually read the things you sign and consider, build an effective model in your mind through which you engage with the world, to that is honest about evaluating just how much anyone can really protect you from anything. Because for a lot of people, they say, oh, well, they have security measures, they must be foolproof, I'll just completely, well, that's that. And then they get a mailer one day from Ticketmaster begrudgingly admitting they had a data breach and they joined up in the class
Yeah,
action. It's like, did you really think you could give your data to everyone and nothing would ever happen? Are you really that
yeah,
shocked? So
yeah,
I think it's, you can only consider so many threats at once, right? You can only really be cognizant of so much at once, because people have lives, they want to do things. I get it. Like, they don't want to always be thinking about, oh, who has my email. But at least in that moment before you volunteer it, you got to at least have some honest talk with yourself of, whatever shiny thing that's being offered to me, is it worth potential of a data breach?
hmm,
And maybe sometimes it is, but other times it's not. um, and a lot of times companies do everything right, but someone really has it in for them, and they can only protect themselves against so much, right? They can have the best security in the world,
yeah,
and if someone wants to take them down, they're going to find a way. So I think it's just, if nothing else, it's important to be honest with ourselves about the practical reality of our existence, which is we're subjected to things far beyond our control. And whether it's an individual or a faceless corporation, so are they. We're all kind of in the same boat there. So just
hmm,
just engage with the world honestly. And if you do that, I think then what naturally emerges from that is an attitude of, yes, they have a responsibility to store my data responsibly, but I have a responsibility to guard it the best I can and use it responsibly. And frankly, I have to manage some of the consequences, even if forces outside of my control lead to inconvenience for me.
yeah,
That's life, as
yeah.
Sinatra said. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I
Uh,
think it's interesting because I feel like we're in a place now where you, to get more efficiency, you have to almost essentially reduce the level of privacy that you have.
Yep.
There is a give and take of that. There is not this, oh well, I can increase my efficiency while also increasing my privacy. It just doesn't seem to get there.
No.
We've got applications like email and Excel that are still around and will be around for a long time. I'm actually surprised that email is still is widely used as it is with
So
all the
insecure.
technology,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's really interesting that goes to a point of like, but people are so comfortable with it. They know it, go back to learning. They don't want to learn new things. They don't want to change.
Yeah.
But they also, there's a comfort in email, because email, used to be just easier than writing a letter, sending a letter, paying for a letter. Like, it was
Right.
free, it was easy, it was quick. And so you always still have these more efficiency gains. And well, people most likely were not going to, you had a better chance of someone reading your email, even when it first started, than you did someone opening your letter at the mail.
Yeah.
Right. As a federal law, right?
Yeah.
You get prosecuted if you're going to open someone else's
Right.
mail. Someone's email was a little bit different, and they didn't have, when it first started. And now you still see, the changes have not been, it hasn't changed at all, really.
Not really. No.
At the end of the day, it really
Yeah.
hasn't changed.
No, I never
And
send
so,
anything secure over email unless it's
right,
an encrypted file of some kind, and
and
I
even
like
then,
talk over the phone to the person about the password or whatever. Like that's yeah. And even then, yeah, you're right. No, I think that speaks to the reality of security as a concept, which, and I am not a cybersecurity specialist. I have people that are. That is not my specific
sure,
role,
yeah,
but I have at least a general overview and understanding of it. And obviously, I
yeah,
deal with those challenges myself as a business owner, right? But I think part of, frankly, how I stay sane engaging in all of this, because I mean, we've worked with clients, help them fight scams, attempts of takeovers of their data and things.
okay,
That's not even something like we shoot for. It's just
yeah,
when you work closely with a business and their technology long enough in our role, and you're the guys who know computers for them,
sure,
eventually you get requests for things like this. So I've seen a fair bit. I've seen some pretty remarkable situations before. We'll just say that,
yeah,
and of just yeah, but I stay sane because I know that at the end of the day, the even though most security is really just security by appearance, right? Truly, um, the vast majority of the human race does not have all three primary components required to be a meaningful threat. You need you need the resources, you need the skills, and you need the will to be a real threat to anyone over anything, right? So like if you there are people who they want to cause harm, but maybe they're broke and they can't afford the resources to do what they want to do, or they don't have the skills that they need, right? Or maybe they have the skills and the resource. Most of the wealthiest people in the world are, they have incredible skills and incredibly resource heavy, but they're not going out of their way to screw people over all the time. I'm sure they do it, but they,
hmm,
it's not their primary. They wouldn't be where they are if that was their goal. Uh, for the most part, you need all three of those things all at once in order to really go for someone and cause them a serious problem. And the vast majority of people are not that, and they don't want to be that. And unless extreme environmental circumstances coerce it out of them, they're never going to be that.
yeah,
So you don't have to, safeguard yourself against everyone and everything. It's actually a very, very small percentage of people. They can still cause a lot of damage, but it's generally 1 in a million. So I think it's useful at least to engage in the world like that. You don't have to be a naive, over trusting person in order to feel safe with your information. You just have to acknowledge that most people aren't really interested
yeah,
in causing that kind of problem to you, and just maybe don't give them a reason to. And then of
yeah. I mean,
course
it's
have your
true.
security policies. But beyond that, yeah, that is the reality of the environment we live in, I think.
Yeah, it's true. Most people don't care about you,
Yeah,
right? I mean, at the
you're
end of
not
the day,
that
it's
special.
just yeah, you're
Yeah,
not that special.
yeah,
It's funny. What you mentioned was I related to an ATM, kind of ATM method, right? So
yeah,
to really get an ATM, all you need is time, and resources,
yeah,
and then the balls to actually steal it in the first place.
yeah.
If you have those three things, to your point, then you're going to eventually be able to get into that
Oh yeah, yeah.
thing, right? So if you
So
have
why
you
don't
have
people break into every ATM every day? Because they don't want to.
they don't want to, or they know that, hey, I don't have the resources but I have the time,
Yep.
and that's only get me so far,
Yeah.
right? Or I have the resources, but I had the time but I don't have the resources,
Yep.
right? So it's like, it's always one of those things. And I think that going back to the, keeping honest people honest, right? And it's like there are certain things that you can do to just say, okay, look, I'm going to do this because I know this is logical. I'm not going to give a stranger my dog's name, my
Yeah.
phone number,
Yeah.
my birthday, my anniversary date.
Yeah.
So things like that. There was someone that's it was going viral for a while. People are going around asking, "Hey, we're just asking people to we're going to see if their passwords are safe. Can you tell us your password?" And then some people are just like, "Oh yeah, my password's this." And it's
Oh
like,
yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Um,
What would your
right?
birthday be if it was your credit card number and expiration date? Like, I'm like, yeah.
And I just and it's just but it's amazing because there are a lot more people than I thought there were that just were like very, I don't even say it's trusting.
Yep.
But it's just I don't know what it is. I don't think it's trusting by any means because I don't think they actually trust the person.
I think a lot of people have just poor security practices. They put too much focus on the wrong things and not on the right things. You don't have to be this like security ninja to live a generally safe life. You just need to make sure the things you are skeptical about are accurate and useful things to be skeptical about, and
Yeah.
you can be trusting on the other things as
One, and it's almost
compared
like
to
a
that.
transfer of responsibility, right?
Yeah.
It goes back to that, question of, well, who's responsible for the privacy? Well, who's responsible for the security as well?
Right.
Well, I don't have to do anything. I gave my stuff to, the company A,
Right.
and they're supposed to do everything for me,
Yeah.
right? Likability is okay. You can be likable. A company can be likable, but doesn't mean you're going to be doing business with that person or
Right.
that company because you like them. It's going to be because you trust them.
Yeah.
When you guys are looking to do training programs and build out these very technical types trainings for coding,
Mhm.
what are you how are you selling that? How do people say, hey, I want to use you guys
Yeah.
versus somebody else?
So I'm gonna give you a bad answer, which is they come to us. So that that helps. I mean, obviously we're scaling more and more. So for the earlier part of our business, we were mostly focused on web app development, and we were doing
Okay.
the work practically. And e-learning actually started as like a side thing. And now it's our primary line of business, which is kind of funny. But that's actually how it began.
That's
Where
awesome.
yeah, I had a friend that I knew back from the game dev days, who I'd met him at a conference years ago, and we'd just been friends ever since. And he started doing e-learning content for game development for a major e-learning provider. And he just mentioned it was something he was doing, and I asked him, "Hey, that sounds interesting." And I didn't even do it under the company because they really want individual authors, and so I just did it under myself as an individual.
Okay.
I talked to them. They wanted usability and design courses, and they really liked me. So they had me do a few UX courses for them, but it was under just my individual self.
Gotcha.
Then COVID hit, and it was a strange time in tech because some companies were really suffering and others were going gangbusters, right? And it was very bipolar all at once. And e-learning demand went through the roof. And for the longest time, I just assumed that that company would only allow individual authors to make content because that's what they always did. But on a
Hmm.
whim, I just asked them, "Hey, would you be open to having a team do things?" And apparently, no one had ever really asked because they're like, "Yeah, sure," but no one else was doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so that was, I mean, the rest is history. We started making a ton of content for them, and the advantage that we had, I we still have to go through formal application process if we want to do specific courses, but I have really good
Sure.
relationships with a lot of the managers, and that definitely helps. And a part of it was just trying to learn, well, what were their interests within their company, of
Hmm.
what kind of struggles do they face in producing content? Because if they're going to produce content in volume, I mean, over time there must be like ways that make it easy and ways that make it hard. And talking to a lot of the managers, I learned that the struggle they really faced with contracting individual subject matter experts to make an entire course was that often they were very great at what they did. I mean, they would be looking for senior engineers at any given one, FANG company of some kind, right? And that's great and all because they paid very competitively, so it was still worth their time. Because a lot of those guys are making like 150, 200K through the gate, right? So it has to pay well.
Hmm.
And if it's all going to use an individual, that's great, right? But
Yep.
time is the issue. They have more money than time, and they're doing this inherently on the side as a side gig, right? Because they're an expert in their given field and they do this one thing and they have a full time, and this is like something sort of on the side to make them more of a personality and an authority in the space, right? So that's the appeal to them. It's not even necessarily just about the money. But let's say, a lot of times these courses, they give them up to like 3 months to do an entire course, hour and a half, 2 hour course, whatever.
Okay.
And they'll spend 2 weeks doing the code and all of the stuff that they like, being the engineer, and then they'll spend the next 2.5 months dragging their feet to get the audio recording and record the
Yeah.
video and give them the final deliverable. And they'll go all the way to that end of that 90-day deadline to give them what they want. And the manager's like the whole time just waiting because their boss is breathing down their neck.
Sure.
And I saw that and I was like, oh, we could do this way faster. So our average turnaround time for a course that length is about 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes
Nice.
5, depending on complexity. So we're doing things in literally a third of the time because we have a team, right?
Yeah.
So we have a subject matter expert who does specifically the thing, the coding, and they'll help draft a script. And then we'll have a video editor do the video production and a voice actor do the voice acting. And because it's
Hmm.
distributed across multiple people who all actually like the thing they're doing and just the thing they're
100%.
doing, it all happens
Yes.
much faster. And we
That's
built an
so
entire
true.
pipeline for that, and we solved a lot of problems for them, and including finding subject matter experts who did very niche things on courses they were having a difficult time finding someone to do. So we became a solution for the management to cross things off their list and get things done fast. Um, and that naturally led to us like, people, uh, some of those authors would find out about us. I got messages on LinkedIn from people, solicitations for work. People come and go at companies, so they come and they go to a new e-learning company and they say, hey, I know you from this, want to work together. And
Yeah.
that's just sort of how it's grown to the point where now this is the majority of what we do. But
That's
it started
awesome.
with focusing on, well, what are the problems that we can solve for them, not just making content for students, but also solving it for the client. And naturally from there, you guys are the guys who solve problems for us.
Yeah.
And it turns out that's a really great way of selling yourself, by just doing the
Yeah.
thing and being mindful of what the stakeholders want. So I've
Yeah.
never spent a dime on any kind of marketing for e-learning work whatsoever. It's never happened. Never had to.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, just finding that right in that gap that you've got to fill, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's so important. And
Yep.
I love what you said around that, getting people to do what they love to do.
And just that.
I
Yep.
that's so key, because so
Yep.
many people end up getting involved with things that, like, okay, I have to do this because I'm available, or because I have the bandwidth for it
Yeah. Or I need
in
the work.
traditional companies, or I need the work
Yeah.
100%,
Hmm.
right?
But
And
also on the flip side of that, doing what I've got to do as the owner, even if I don't want to do it, because it's not that
yeah.
everything's always been sunshine and rainbows all the time. There have been problems. Uh, Sometimes, I mean, we had a subject matter expert that had a severe medical emergency and had to drop off, and
Hmm.
I had to pick up the slack for him. And the consequence of that was I had an international trip that I had to go on. I was going to be out of the country in East Asia for 2 weeks, and our course was due in the middle of that time. So I
Nice.
flew halfway across the planet with studio grade audio recording equipment in my luggage, like $1,000 worth of stuff, and I spent a
Yeah.
day and a half in my hotel room. I could have been on vacation recording that audio so that the
Yeah.
experience would sound totally consistent with the audio I had
Sure.
done before I left, and it would get submitted on time because you have to maintain that relationship with that client. Right.
Yeah.
And we made it happen. And, that was not a cheap trip. So, frankly, no, being on doing that instead of doing what I wanted to do wasn't great. But
Yeah.
you have to do what you have to do. And as long as, I mean, I've been working them for over 6 years, I earned plenty of goodwill. I probably could have asked, hey, can I
Yeah.
not do this? But we had a deadline. I was going to meet the deadline. So,
Yeah.
yeah, the putting people in position where they get to do what they want to do. But at the end of the day, if you're the owner and you run the show and you're responsible, you got it. You have to go the distance. And it rarely happens. If you're doing things right, you have a great process. But when it does, you got to acknowledge it in the moment, act on it, make it happen. And that's how you maintain that status and that relationship. So I don't have to go and sell. And
Yeah.
we just keep what
And,
we've got. Yeah.
and I would say that doing what you say you're going to do, right?
Yep.
To add to that, right? It's not just doing what you have to do; it's also doing what you said you're going to do.
Yep.
You said, "I'm going to deliver. I'm going to deliver,"
Yep.
and that's a team effort too. At the end of the day, right? It's not. Yes, the ownership is on the owner, but it also is something that when you have people that are aligned with their ability to perform at capacity, and they've reached their potential of within that role,
Yep.
they're more likely to say, "Oh yeah, I can do that too," or "I don't mind doing that."
Yep.
When it's the exception, not the rule
Right.
in most cases.
Yep.
So, well, I know we're kind of getting towards the end of it.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of, I know we could go for another couple hours, I think,
Oh, yeah. This is great.
and we'll have to do this again. But
Absolutely.
as we kind of look forward, where do you see the most significant opportunity that business have to innovate in their space, whether it's e-learning, whether it's a completely unrelated business? From a technology perspective and where kind of things are going, where do you see businesses have the biggest opportunity?
Whew. So at least for us, we've moved into the e-learning space. We have the opportunity. We enjoy it. I love that. This is like the positive side of AI. It's been a huge productivity improvement tool. It's reduced the cost of doing business in the e-learning space for us more so than it has in any other line of business that we do. I mean, it's literally halved the amount of time and labor that we have in order to produce the content that we do. So it means we can just make more of it, right?
Yeah.
And my guys stay fed and stay happy, but it's, we just keep doing more of what we do. So that's a part of like where we've moved, but it does speak more broadly to how these productivity tools. I'm hoping there's a new generation. Well, there is a new generation of project management tools as well that are being developed. We're actually taking part in the building of one of those because a lot of the
Oh,
old
nice.
stuff that's been out there for 15 plus years, they're so slapped together at this point that it's really time for a new generation of that, of empowering virtual work. And that, I think, if I were to try and summarize where I hope much of the work environment goes, it's making it uh, more practical and more convenient for people to work from home, but also building supportive structures that enable them to be good work from home workers, because just working from home is not a solution for everyone. It is, in fact, a problem for a lot of people because not
Sure.
everyone's
Oh,
home environment
100%.
lends well to it. Not everyone's personality lends well to it. They don't have the discipline for it. Maybe they're not going to build the discipline for it. Maybe they have distractions, and going to the office is actually really positive compartmentalization for them.
Sure.
So I'm hoping that a lot of the combination of these productivity tools and new technologies help people, when appropriate, work from home better and help businesses appreciate that more. But I'm also hoping we find a better way to manage the HR side of that. Because especially, I mean, we've always been a virtual company from the start. When I was in games, I managed a lot of virtual teams. We did a lot of virtual work, so it just made sense that we would do that. In the beginning, it worked against us because a lot of people before pre-COVID, a lot of people didn't take you seriously and think you were a real business if you were virtual. They thought, oh, you're too cheap for an office. We're not going to do business with you.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I don't want to waste money in office if I don't need it. My industry doesn't need that. And so it was a bit of a climb in the beginning. But when COVID hit, it became an advantage because even a
Sure.
lot of people in web shut down because they didn't know how to manage teams remotely. We did.
Yep.
Now it's a major
It's
selling
true.
point. So it totally inverted that entire situation for us, and we got more business in that year, literally double what we had the prior year.
Oh, that's great.
Uh, just because, if nothing else, we were open and functioning and
Yeah.
not, crawling through trying to manage remote teams and learn how to do it as we were also doing our job. So it was really great for us, but I knew how, and all my people knew how to be good remote workers, right? So yeah, I hope that, and you're seeing, every time I go on LinkedIn, I see some featured article about how X major company has changed its mind yet again on remote worker, is in the middle of a lawsuit
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
this.
It's
It's like,
crazy.
make up your minds, come on. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping we stop seeing fights over this and we see some practical solutions and some practical management structures and HR solutions, and the average worker can figure out if they're good for this or not, and if so, how to be good at it, and that the tools are there to support them. That's what I would say. I think is
Yeah.
coming, and I hope is coming, and I'm going to try and e-learning is part of that. Learning how to be a good remote worker remotely, right?
Yeah. No,
So
it's
yeah,
true. It's so true. I think, there's two sides of that, right? There's always that companies sometimes don't know, most times don't actually know their employees. They actually need to learn about their employees.
yep,
But I would also say that they also need to learn about themselves.
yeah,
Because when you have things like this of like, oh, we're gonna do this, and they just the back and forth, it becomes this. Well, do we really know ourselves? Do we know what we want to be? Do we want to know what we want to do? We know how we want to come across and
right.
the company we want to be? So I think that's really important. So, man, this has been really enlightening. I think it's been great conversations. Love to have you on again, and thanks for your time. Appreciate it, and we'll talk next time.
Absolutely, man. Always a pleasure. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye.